Welcome to this explainer. Let's jump right in. October 1962. It's a month literally etched into history as the moment the entire world just held its breath. For 13 agonizing days, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in this massive standoff over nuclear-armed Soviet missiles in Cuba, which, by the way, is just 90 miles from American shores. The sheer scale of what was at stake here is honestly almost impossible to wrap your head around today. We're not just talking about a clash of political ideas. This was a staring contest on the absolute edge of the thermonuclear abyss.
Okay, let's dive into this. 100 million. Actually, scratch that. Make it 200 million. 50 years after the dust settled, military historians ran the numbers, and they estimated that if diplomacy had failed, if the planned U.S. airstrikes and invasion had actually happened in that third week of October, the resulting nuclear exchange would have wiped out over 100 million Americans and over 100 million Russians. 200 million lives gone in a matter of hours. The sheer scale of this potential loss was just unlike anything humanity had ever faced before, or since.
And the visceral ticking clock terror of that reality, it wasn't just some abstract fear for the general public. It was actively paralyzing the highest levels of government. Take U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. He later remembered leaving the Oval Office on this beautiful fall evening, right at the peak of the crisis, looking up at the sunset and literally thinking, quote, "I thought it was the last Saturday I would ever see." The guys holding the keys to the world's most destructive arsenals legitimately believed the world was about to end. Section 1. The Scale of Annihilation. And this brilliantly illustrates why things got so heated. To really grasp how we ended up on that Saturday, we have to look at the big picture. Both superpowers were acting out of this deeply ingrained sense of strategic vulnerability. We often picture the Cold War as this perfectly equal match, but the nuclear imbalance at the time was actually massive. The U.S. had roughly 5,000 strategic nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union, only about 300. Plus, the U.S. had recently put Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy, literally right on the Soviet border. So, impartially speaking, from the Soviet perspective, putting missiles in Cuba was a strategic equalizer. Premier Nikita Khrushchev was just looking for a deterrent to protect his new ally, Fidel Castro, and kind of level the playing field.
But here is a chilling detail, something that wasn't even discovered until decades later. Aside from the big missiles the U.S. spy plane spotted, the Soviet Union had already deployed over 100 tactical nuclear weapons to Cuba. And worse, the local Soviet commander on the ground had the authority to launch them at a U.S. invasion force without even asking Moscow for authorization codes. No way, right? The U.S. military, who were pushing so hard for an invasion, had absolutely zero idea they were about to step into a fully armed nuclear minefield.
Section 2. 13 Days of Tension. So with the stage set and the weapons loaded, let's map out the sheer momentum of these tension-filled days. The clock officially started ticking on October 14th. That's when Major Richard Heiser flew a U-2 spy plane high over Cuba and snapped photographic evidence of Soviet ballistic missiles being assembled. On October 16th, President Kennedy gets the briefing. He quickly pulls together an advisory group called XCOM, and for nearly a week, they debate in total secrecy. The military is pushing incredibly hard for an immediate airstrike. But Kennedy, he's wary of the unstoppable chain reaction that could trigger, so he opts for a middle path. Then, October 22nd, he goes on national TV to tell the whole world. Suddenly, a 90-mile distance to U.S. shores meant we were literally minutes to midnight. Section 3. Standoff at the quarantine line. Let's move to this and see how it builds. Now, Kennedy's strategy here was absolutely brilliant in its careful legal maneuvering. He sends the U.S. Navy to basically form a ring around Cuba to stop Soviet ships from delivering more weapons. But he deliberately doesn't call it a blockade. He specifically calls it a quarantine. Why does that matter? Well, under international law, a blockade is a formal act of war. A quarantine, though, that was a measured, defensive move that put the burden of starting a shooting war squarely on the approaching Soviet ships. But Kennedy also made the apocalyptic stakes crystal clear in that TV address. He said, quote, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba as an attack by the Soviet Union," end quote. By saying that, he completely removed the illusion of a proxy war. As Soviet cargo ships approached that quarantine line on October 24th, the whole world was bracing for the first shots of World War III. Miraculously, the Soviet ships either stopped short or turned around. But the crisis was far from over, because the missiles already sitting in Cuba were getting very close to operational readiness. This standoff pushed the United States all the way to DEFCON 2. For context, that is literally one step below outright nuclear war. Strategic Air Command bombers were dispersed across the country, fully loaded with nuclear weapons, just sitting on runways with their engines idling, ready to take off at a moment's notice. The entire globe was teetering right on the very edge.
Which brings us to Section 4, the price of de-escalation.
We frequently talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis as this, bloodless victory of diplomacy. A situation where two superpowers stared each other down and both just blinked. But honestly, that's a historical myth. While that massive scale of global annihilation was avoided, real human lives were sacrificed in the shadows of this brinkmanship. So the crucial point is this: there was a very real loss brought about when these nations were pushed to the brink. On October 27th, which was the absolute most dangerous day of the crisis, a U.S. U-2 plane was blown out of the sky by a Soviet missile over Cuba, killing the 35-year-old pilot, Major Rudolf Anderson. On top of that, the rapid mobilization of global military assets came at a deadly cost. 11 crew members of RB-47 reconnaissance jets were killed in crashes, and 7 more died when a transport plane stalled out delivering ammo to Guantanamo Bay. All in all, 19 Americans died. It's a complete miracle that the loss of Major Anderson didn't trigger an immediate retaliatory strike. The military had previously agreed it would, but Kennedy held back, buying just a little more time for one last diplomatic push.
Section 5, the secret compromise. And that diplomatic push happened entirely in the shadows, orchestrating a way out of the abyss. While the public watched the standoff on TV, U.S. Attorney General Robert Kennedy was secretly meeting with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin at a Chinese restaurant in D.C., and later at the Justice Department. They hashed out a 3-part deal. Step 1. Khrushchev publicly withdraws the missiles from Cuba. Step 2. The U.S. publicly pledges never to invade Cuba. But the real linchpin was Step 3. The United States secretly agreed to dismantle its Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy. It was a straight-up trade. Section 6, Legacy of the Brink.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how the aftermath played out. When Khrushchev broadcast his acceptance of the deal on October 28th, the immediate crisis was diffused. But the way this deal was structured completely reshaped global politics. The asymmetry of the public perception was just wild. Because the removal of U.S. missiles from Turkey was kept completely secret, to the rest of the world, it looked like Kennedy had just won a massive game of chicken. Kennedy's image absolutely soared. Khrushchev, on the other hand, looked like he had totally caved. This perceived humiliation deeply angered the Soviet Politburo, and it was a huge reason why Khrushchev was ousted from power just 2 years later. And Fidel Castro? He was infuriated. He felt Cuba had been used as a pawn and then completely abandoned.
Ultimately, this incredibly close brush with death permanently altered international relations. Both sides realized that communication delays had nearly caused a war, which led to them creating the direct Washington-Moscow hotline. The U.S. quietly pulled its missiles from Turkey 6 months later, but the Soviets, vowing they would never be humiliated by a strategic imbalance like that again, massively ramped up their investment in intercontinental ballistic missiles, which really accelerated the arms race. But at the exact same time, that shared terror of October 1962 laid the groundwork for the very first nuclear test ban treaty.
So, what does this all mean for us? The Cuban Missile Crisis stands as the ultimate cautionary tale of scale and loss in the modern age. It shows us exactly how quickly geopolitical maneuvering can just spiral out of control, and honestly, how much pure luck is required to prevent absolute annihilation. Looking at the incredibly complex world we live in right now, with way faster weapons and way more nuclear-armed nations, it leaves us with a pretty haunting question to reflect on. If the ticking clock of nuclear escalation started today, are we truly any better equipped to stop it? Think about that. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning and stay curious.